and welcome to the first Citizen Media Expert Interview Series. Ashoka Changemakers, with the support of Google, launched Citizen Media, a global innovation competition to find solutions that use media to catalyze participatory citizenship. Media connects people to their world, gives voice to their dreams and ideas, and equips them with knowledge to improve their lives and the lives of others. But even in this age of pervasive media, millions lack access to the most basic information tools. The Citizen Media competition seeks to change this reality. In this series, we'll connect with media experts from around the world to explore major trends, obstacles, and what lies ahead.
I'm working with Ashoka Changemakers, yes, and I'm sure you know about our global competition, Citizen Media competition.
I believe Global Voices has partnered with you on it.
Yes, and I know you're a very busy person, so I really appreciate your time. What I'm doing right now is just, I'm generally for Ashoka, I blog for them on Huffington Post.
Oh, sure, okay.
So I'm just going to jump right in. Let me ask you very directly, who in the world today does not have access to information who should, and who does not have access to a means for expression who should?
Well, the should is sort of interesting, right? I would pretty much argue that you want everybody to have access to information and access to expression. I'm sure we can come up with edge cases, but in general, I would argue that you always want to respond to speech with more speech. So, given that these things are universals or as close to universals as we get, then I think we have to ask the question, what's out there? What do people have access to? It's been a pretty dramatic shift over the last 10 years, mostly with the rise of the mobile phone, taking huge chunks of the world that had almost no access to information and increasing information access. So, the fact that we've seen mobile phone use, hit well over 3 billion, I think we're now closing in on 4, really changes the playing field in terms of having the potential to access information. Now, whether it gets you what you need, whether it gets it to you in your language, whether it gets you relevant information, whether it gets you sufficiently rich information, those are all really good and really difficult questions. And certainly there are parts of the world where usually for reasons of economic restriction, also for reasons of language, also for reasons of restrictions on media, people are not getting as much information as we would hope. But the situation is very, very different than it was even 10 years ago. As far as expression, there's at least 2 challenges there, right? The first challenge is, do you have the opportunity to speak? And again, that's changed quite a bit. Certainly the rise of blogging, photo sharing, video sharing, microblogging have brought these tools to well over 1 billion people. If we add together the Facebookers and the bloggers and everybody else, we're well over 1 billion. Whether or not you get heard is an entirely different matter. And one of the big things that the media sphere is sort of trying to wrestle with right now is we have a much larger potential audience than we had years ago. But we have, in comparison, so much larger an expansion of people speaking that there's all sorts of problems now about aggregating and curating information, filtering information, and trying to ensure that people who should be heard do get heard. And I think for me, in many ways, those are actually where the most interesting challenges are.
That's interesting because there's a lot of talk about the old media, the new media, and in many ways, the challenge and the criticism of mainstream old media was that they were doing exactly this, curating, but just doing it in a way that was too narrow. And now, if you take, for example, Global Voices, which you co-founded, you're going to run into the same problem.
Oh, we're happy to acknowledge that problem. We're a heavily edited website. Curation is not the problem. At some point, you have to figure out a way to sort through information. Historically, the way that we've sorted through information is that the ability to publish has been pretty restricted. It's either been restricted by, historically, publication was the right of the crown, and then publication was restricted to those who had the means to publish, whether it was print or broadcast. The first promise of the internet revolution was that everyone was going to have a chance to raise their voice. The problem with that is that you can't hear everybody, and you end up with tough dynamics that people aren't entirely happy with. You end up with a long tail, where the people in the head get a lot of attention, and the people at the very far end of the tail only get attention if people are searching for them. You have all sorts of people saying, well, perhaps this will all work itself out, but, honestly, it doesn't seem to. And so what's happened is we've sort of traded some of those old media biases. And I'm certainly not going to tell you that old media was unbiased, but we traded it in for biases of what people want to search for, sort of in the middle phase, and then what people's friends know about, sort of in the current phase. So if you sort of go back to the 1990s, people were grousing that we're only hearing some voices, we're not hearing other voices. The media is owned by big corporations. They don't give voice to the little man. Folks like me were standing up and saying, there's systematic biases on what countries we hear from and don't hear from. Maybe we can take it on with social media. So social media, suddenly everyone gets to speak. But now the only way you're going to find it is if you search for it. And so if you're actively going out there and saying, I want to find the voices of people in the developing world, you might be able to search for them and find them, but they're hard to find. They're hard to understand. You probably need translation. You probably need contextualization. Nowadays, you can stumble on them if people in your social circle are following them. And it's possible that people in your social circle might be able to provide you some of that context, but only if your social circle includes very diverse parts of the world. So where I sort of come out on this is curation wasn't the problem. Bad curation was the problem. And that, we know that media has all sorts of biases that we don't like. We know that if it believes that media doesn't work well for us. We know that the obsession with celebrity doesn't work well with us. We know that the obsession with the American political horse race doesn't work well for us. The flip side is that we also know that as the world gets more connected, not having information about the developing world becomes a real problem. You saw President Obama berate his cabinet after the Tunisian government fell, sort of saying, was anyone watching this? Were you guys reading blogs or anything? I mean, didn't anyone see this coming? And of course the answer was you could have seen it coming about a month earlier if you were reading Tunisian blogs, just that nobody was. So what you need is a media that is capable of listening to citizen voices, that is capable of translating them and contextualizing them, and that can figure out how to share space in the media agenda with the stories that we already like to cover in both the professional press and in the participatory press. So it isn't a matter of first we round up all the gatekeepers. It's more a matter of let's get gatekeepers to understand that their function is really, really important. It's a really important civic function, and that I think there's a moral and social responsibility to ensure that people are curating a conversation that's global and inclusive.
That sort of dovetails into this idea that you've talked about before, about how there's been an increase in the supply of information, sort of what you're just talking about, but there has not been a corresponding increase in demand, and that you want to be part of increasing demand. Partly, your tools for doing that, I think you've said, are images, narrative, and human connection. So does that mean that the sort of very low production, possibly not good storytelling aspects of citizen journalists, if you want to call them that, or bloggers, is not compelling enough to increase the demand? In other words, do you need professional storytelling and high production values in order to achieve this increase in demand?
So let's start with that sort of increase in demand, right? I was talking before about curators, and I would really love it if good curators were pulling in stories not just from America, but from Tunisia and from Mongolia as well. What a curator will tell you is we're trying, but not only do we have trouble finding these stories, but we also have the Migo problem, the my eyes glaze over problem. I think a lot of journalists right now are trying to get people to pay attention to the crisis in Somalia, the food uncertainty. And not just Somalia, also the Ogaden and et cetera, et cetera. It's a classic Migo story, right? I think people sort of look at it and go, Somalia, they haven't had a government for years. No one knows how to fix this. There's nothing I can do about it. I don't have any interest in this. And I don't think people say it sort of out of hostility. I think they sort of say it with a certain amount of sadness. Like, I don't know how I would connect to this. I don't know what I would do around it. It's hard for me to follow that story as well as, say, a hopeful story like the Tahrir protest. I think that when you lack that demand, it's really hard for curators to do the right thing. And they sort of say, look, there's no appetite for this. I'm giving it as much attention as I can. I need the public to come part of the way with me. I think the question sort of then becomes, what would get the public to pay more attention to a story like that? And I think we have all sorts of shortcuts that we know how to use as professional journalists that citizens are starting to figure out how to use. I think one is image. I think seeing an image, not necessarily a professional image, but a striking image will often make something tangible and real in a way that it might not otherwise be. I know that when we were writing a lot about Tahrir, sort of before mainstream America caught up with the story, one image, which was that of the police turning a fire hose on people praying, really caught an enormous amount of attention. That was a citizen image. That was someone at the protest who shot the photo, passed it around. But it was an image that asked a question And I think people looked at the image and wanted to know, wait a second, this is not what we've been told to worry about with instability in the Middle East. People peacefully praying while their government turns hoses on them. That feels a lot like the civil rights movement in the U.S. and some of the imagery there. So I think that can be very powerful. I think that narrative is something that gets people to pay attention to stories they never otherwise would have opened their eyes to. I talk a lot with my friend David Weinberger about international news. He says, the way that I get international news is I open up the New Yorker, and I don't necessarily care about, the country that they're talking about, but I'm on board for the narrative. The writing's so darn good. And it gets me to pay attention to Nauru because Jack Hitt's story about financial transfers to this tiny Pacific nation is so well written that it gets people along for the ride. And I think the one that we haven't explored enough, but seems most powerful in the age of social media, is that social media lowers the barrier to knowing someone, and particularly to knowing someone in another country. We know that one of the effects of social media is that it reduces the cost of maintaining a friendship. You seem to be capable of keeping up with many more people on somewhere like Facebook by sort of casually checking in with them than if you had to give them a phone call and spend an hour catching up. And so it's sort of suggesting that we might be able to conquer Dunbar's number, rather than having 150 people who we sort of know and socially groom. Maybe we can actually pay attention to a much larger set of people because the tools make it easier. If that's the case, maybe we can start having human connections, one-on-one connections with people in different parts of the world, and maybe those connections will make it easier for us to pay attention to those stories and demand more coverage.
I mean, that would certainly be less onerous than relying on people who are skilled in, narrative. I mean, the New Yorker writer is a pretty high bar.
The New Yorker is a pretty high bar, but here's a bad example, but an interesting example. What Tom McMaster did with pretending to be a Syrian lesbian was basically take a story that he felt wasn't getting enough attention and put a narrative on top. Now, he put a narrative that was fictitious, constructed, and speaking in someone else's voice. But the fact that he managed to get so much attention for it actually points a little bit to his root argument, which is that narrative works. It doesn't necessarily need to be a New Yorker quality writer. What it does need to be is someone who says, hey, my reader doesn't know politics behind this situation. My reader doesn't know the places that I'm talking about. I'm going to talk not just to my 5 or 10 friends who share my common context. I'm going to write for a much broader audience, and I'm going to try to help them understand the full complexity of this situation. And when I talk about, getting better at narrative, I wish we would all become Richard Kapuscinski, but that's not going to happen. And in the meantime, maybe at least we can get better at sort of explaining why stories are important to us and how the individual events fit into the larger story pattern, even if we're just talking about the events in our local community.
The McMaster thing sort of leads me to my next question, which I'm sure you've been asked many times, but how do we know who to trust?
You don't, but you didn't with old media either. That was actually the most dangerous illusion of old media, was that you could read it sort of assuming that everything had been carefully vetted and fully fact-checked. Fact-checking's been on the decline in media for a long time. Fact-checking is pretty uncommon in real time. There are rare networks that do it and take it seriously. I think NPR's response policy and corrections policy is thoroughly admirable, but it's also pretty much unique of giving a correction as much airtime as the original point got. In general, as it moves faster, it's wrong a lot more often. And you would need to, and it's biased a lot more often. That's the shift that's taken place in American media over the last 20 years. We have a lot more opinion showing up in a news context. So you already need to be using those hermeneutic tools to sort of figure out who's saying what and how do we trust them. And if you're not doing that, you're not literate to read the professional media, never mind the citizen media. Citizen media adds some other factors to it and other complications to them. The believability of someone arbitrarily showing up and saying something online is next to zero. Online, you develop a reputation through iterated practice. Someone who's writing for the first time, it's very, very hard to know whether you can take that person seriously. Someone who's been writing for 2 or 3 years, responding to comments, participating in arguments, you have a pretty good sense of who that person is and where she's coming from. You can see the situations where people have called that person out and what she's been right or wrong about. And at that point, you can probably make a much better educated decision on how to trust somebody. In a funny sense, it can actually be easier sometimes to figure out the credibility of a blogger, because you can find all of a person's postings in one place, than it can be to look at the agenda of a mainstream media commentator, where you often have to go through and sort through it. But what this all means is that the notion that you pick up a media source, it is authoritative and correct and right and unbiased is an illusion that, if it ever were true, sure isn't true now. And it basically forces us to be much more careful and cautious readers. It also, I think, puts a whole new set of responsibilities on curators. And so at Global Voices, we try pretty hard to get a sense for who we're amplifying, where they're coming from, and sort of disclaiming when we're not able to verify the facts, or disclaiming people's political points of view and sort of where those ideas are coming from. Because we want you to know that we're not trying to give you that authoritative voice. We're trying to give you the voice of, here are what people in this country are saying. And here are the voices that we're seeing. We're trying to give you a sampling of. And we try to do that even when we really don't like those voices. During the Iranian Revolution, we were one of the few places where you could hear Iranians writing in Persian. And Iranians writing in Persian tended to be pro-regime, tended to think that the protests were really a U.S. and U.K. plot. And we got a tremendous amount of flack for translating and publishing those words. But we thought it was utterly critical because you weren't getting that from CNN, you weren't getting that from the New York Times, you weren't getting it from a lot of other mainstream media sources who should have been doing that responsible work.
Do you have a similar situation in Egypt, or was Egypt pretty much pro-democracy?
What's hard about it is that we only cover online media. And my guess is that the people who were strong Mubarak supporters, and there were some, were not major users of online media. At our best, I would hope that we would say, you have to understand, this may not be everyone's view. And we probably did not do it as well around Egypt as we did around Iran. But I think what I'm really sort of trying to argue there is you've got to provide context as a curator, and you've got to have a lot of context as a reader. And the danger is when you read stuff that is so comfortable, that matches your preconceptions so closely, that you don't look for the context. But the other danger is when you read something that seems to come from such an authoritative source that you assume that you don't need the context. A lot of mainstream media got Iran badly wrong. And they did it because they assumed that these really well-educated English language voices telling them that the government was about to fall were widely representative of opinion in Iran. And, they weren't.
Right.
They were one group of Iranians. A lot of them were in the diaspora. Some of the people who were sort of most famous around the Green Movement weren't in Iran. They were children of dissidents who'd left the generation before. Yes, they had access to crime. But what was so interesting is that it wasn't entirely the fault of a network like CNN. Poor CNN started getting yelled at for not covering the revolution. And they were desperate to talk about what was going on. They had no reporters on the ground. They couldn't have reporters on the ground. So they leaned heavily into social media. And you would have these weird things where you would see a CNN anchor reading Twitter on cable television. And occasionally the anchor would think to say, of course we can't verify any of this. But, that's meaningless, right? You're broadcasting it on CNN. You're implicitly saying this is the news.
Yeah.
What you really should be saying is, news has changed. This is now part of the news too. And hey, you news viewer, you're going to have to develop a whole new skill set because we're reporting this stuff in a very, very different way. And we should be, digging in more and contextualizing more, but you're going to have to do it too.
What's the next big place that's going to open up with a lot more access to information and expression that hasn't had it, do you think?
I think it's already happened, and I think the U.S. just hasn't figured it out yet. I think it's China. Mm-hmm. I think that the U.S. read on China tends to be the Chinese are the most progressive centers of the internet out there. They control all online speech. It's a sterile, state-controlled state. If you think about it, it's sort of absurd on its surface, right? You have 400 million people accessing the Chinese internet. If it were just government propaganda, it probably, would not be as popular as it is. And in fact, what's happening on the Chinese internet is that there's a remarkable ability to access information. I was talking with this Chinese student about a site called Yiyan. And Yiyan is a site that translates English language news stories into Chinese through crowdsourcing. And so you can read a good chunk of The Guardian, The Economist, The New York Times, Scientific American, Time in Chinese, often within 48 hours of when an article's been published. So Chinese readers actually have quite a bit of access to English language dialogue. This is not to say that it's uncensored. A story about China-Taiwan relations probably isn't going to find its way onto Yiyan. And if it did, it would probably get the site censored. and they actually had to shut down for a while to build in hooks for the censors to control sensitive material. But just to think about it in parallel, where would you go in this country to find out what are the hottest topics in the Chinese blogosphere or Twitter sphere?
I don't know.
There isn't.
Yeah.
Well, there isn't.
Yeah.
We do a little bit of it. There's a guy named Roland Sung in Hong Kong who runs a site that's phenomenally popular with China watchers because he translates thousands and thousands of words from Chinese media every day. And there's one or two other blogs that do substantial translation from Chinese to English. But this is one of those things where the American view is basically, we've got free media, we see the world. Those poor Chinese, if they could only see what they're missing, they would rise up and overthrow the chain. Craziness. There's actually enormous amounts more media freedom in China than there was a decade ago. And there's probably more access, there's certainly more access to U.S. media than the U.S. has access to Chinese media. It's not to say that it's uncensored, but that it's a remarkably rich and complicated environment. And actually, it looks like censorship is getting harder and harder to pull off. When you see the rise of these microblogging services, in Chinese they call them Weibo, they're incredibly hard for the censors to keep up with because someone will put out a report and it will very quickly go viral. And censorship tends to require time. You can block a keyword, but only if you know the keyword to block. So the recent example with this was this train crash where, after a few hours, the censors had figured out that they wanted to block the words associated with the location of the train crash. But for the first couple of hours, the information was flowing quite freely on the Weibo, and people were getting a great deal of information. So I really think circumstances have changed radically in that country, and I think we're all still sort of catching up with what those changes are.
Why are you so optimistic about what increased freedom of expression is going to mean for the world?
That's an intriguing question. It seems in general that more open societies, more just societies that recognize the needs of their people are societies that encourage rather than limit free expression. Free expression, first of all, the suppression of free expression tends to be the symptom of a very dysfunctional government. It's a government that knows that it lacks legitimacy and therefore doesn't want people talking about its illegitimacy. Second, freedom of expression allows a broader group of people to involve themselves with solving problems. So rather than sort of saying, it's the government's problem, they're going to fix this for us, freedom of expression allows people to sort of say, let's take on these problems by ourselves. And let's look for solutions, and either we can demand that the government does them, or we can organize ourselves and get them done. It increases the number of people who can be on the solving side of things rather than on the suffering side of things. I think there's an argument to be made that freedom of expression is pretty critical for a certain type of revolution, not the sort of Marxist-Leninist kick over the apple cart and blow everything up revolution, but more the Anglo-American revolution. Let's have a serious debate about how we want to be governed, how we want governments to work. That's something that is made possible by a lot of people having access to the tools of speech. So I should say I just finished drafting a chapter titled In Defense of Cyber Utopianism. And the very quick defense basically says, separate two ideas. One idea is that the internet could help make things better by increasing our power to communicate. The second is the idea that technology inevitably leads to any sort of a change. The first idea, I think, is really worthwhile. The second idea is pure bull. The problem is when we talk about something like cyber optimism or cyber utopianism, we tend to blur those two together. And so, someone like Evgeny Morozov will sort of say, Hillary Clinton, internet freedom agenda, she's assuming that we just add internet and then we get freedom. And whether or not that's a fair characterization of how the State Department is viewing this, there's part of that idea that isn't wrong, in my opinion, which is to say that I do think tools of communication in the long run are empowering the citizen movement. I think they're probably more empowering the citizen movement than they are to authoritarian movement. I think the fact that more people have a chance to speak means you have more alternatives to a single government voice. Whether they will be used that way and whether they will inevitably lead towards change, absolutely not. I think, there's all sorts of possibilities that this goes the wrong way. But that's a stupid debate to have. The interesting debate to have is to say, how do we get our technologies to do what we want them to? If we want a world that is more just and more representative and involves more perspectives and more voices and has more fairness for more people, then let's build it. These systems that we're talking about are in most cases less than 20 years old. I've been around for the entirety of the consumer internet and have been employed in building the entirety of the consumer internet during the whole time. If we don't like what we get out of this, if we don't like how we're building these tools, let's fix them. Let's build different ones. Let's build ones that are more inclusive. Let's build ones that lead towards the societies we want and not towards the societies we don't want. That's an interesting question.
One you will be taking on at MIT, I'm guessing.
What I am writing about at the very moment.
Excellent. Well,
at the very moment. It's very day.
Good luck with your book. I'll be very anxious to see that. It's coming out next year, is that right?
Probably late next year.
Late next year.
It's
Okay.
due to Norton at sort of the turn of the year, and you know how long it takes to get these things out.
Best of luck with that and with your new venture at MIT, and thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it, Ethan.
Absolutely, my pleasure.